are in this category, and I think they're just kind of languishing out there. So maybe you know what's the status of them, maybe you don't, but I wanted to just dovetail on Councilor Janey's question on the letters of non-opposition.
Yeah, it's not a huge number at all. It's applicants, maybe it's 5 or 6 or 7 who went through the process before this new process that's in place, and so they're all in different various phases. But I think anyone who received a letter of non-opposition from this body should certainly be allowed to go through the process. And you know, I'm happy to talk kind of offline on all those, but that's just more of a policy recommendation that you make sure you put the appropriate grandfather language into the ordinance.
But for folks' edification, particularly those watching at home, so there was a period of time when you needed the letter of non-opposition, and then and some received it, 5 or 6 of them. And then at some point, something changed, and kind of what changed so that made basically the letter of non-opposition obsolete.
Yeah.
And then those folks either needed to be grandfathered, which I don't think they have, or they needed to start this new process. So again, maybe not the best question for you, but I just because you have working knowledge of it.
So it was the medical regime had required a letter of non-opposition, did not require a host community agreement. And now both medical and adult use requires the host community agreement, but does not require the letter of non-opposition. So the people who got the first round of that, the letter of non-opposition, may or may not have the host community agreement. They're all in various phases while they're building out their facilities. And then, you know, so they need to be brought forward, I believe, while they're in some form of a limbo, if you will. But I think they have legal rights to move forward. And I would just think that being consistent with state law and just regular legal law, they have the right that gets included into your drafting of the ordinance.
I would agree. And just a matter of basic fairness, if they've been in through that process, whether it's through investment or leases or contracts, I mean, if they're being sort of held off to the side, then I think as a matter of basic fairness, we got to address those first, and then we can talk about other things. So, but thank you, Councilor Janey.
Yes. The other thing you mentioned that I thought was a very good point was expanding the definition of disproportionate impact. You had the maps. I noticed when we did our own analysis of the maps that, you know, the Boston Common was in there, and areas in Back Bay were in there and probably should not be in there. Also, the buffer zone, 1,800 you said for Cambridge, but the equity applicants are exempt. I think that's important as well. So I appreciate that. But I think that's it for me. I want to make sure that we have time.
Thank you, Councilor Janey. Councilor Flynn, any initial questions of this panel?
No, at this time.
Thank you. Councilor Zakhem, no. Councilor Siomo, any questions of Councilor Baker?
More of a statement on the point where so I was heavily involved in a medical operation coming to my district, extensive, you know, through the community groups. They actually won a vote, which I was shocked that they won, but they did win it. And we at that point, we negotiated a mitigation package for the neighborhood that would stay in the neighborhood. But when that process was like that came through in my district, it kind of came through me because they needed our kind of walk the line letter of non-opposition. But I was able to talk to the proponent about, you know, what the security plan is, what, you know, making sure that you're going to hire from within the community. So I actually was part of that, and it was a long process, and the neighborhoods went through it. So I think that's something that we definitely need to make sure that happens. And so where do we get? Are we planning on coming up with the? And Mr. Chair, I'm just throwing this out there. Are we coming up with the tracks of how they will be, or are we going to go by the state's tracks? Do we know that? Or
so in the language and the ordinance, it's aligned with what the state has defined, but I'm very open to expanding and making sure that we are being intentional about who we're including in here.
And Mr. Chair, through you, so we looking, so all the applicants do all the applicants now have to fall within these guidelines? Is that what we're looking to do?
Moving forward, Councilor Janey's ordinance would be the ordinance that would govern sort of city applications, city criteria.
Right, but to be clear, anyone can apply. So this sets up criteria not just for an equity program,
Right.
but for anyone. So there'd be clear criteria on how we're judging applicants, whether you're an equity applicant or a non-equity applicant.
Okay, okay.
It just prioritizes local businesses from communities that have been disproportionately impacted, which I do believe that we can look at whether or not the state regulations are the appropriate way of defining the disproportionately impacted. Thank you.
Okay,
versus some city definitions.
Thank you.
But the goal was to be aligned with what the state was saying.
Thank you, Council.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chair Ignas. Any, Councilor Wu have any comments at this time? Councilor O'Malley, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just actually wanted to echo a similar situation to the previous speaker. We have a situation in West Roxbury where a medicinal-only operator went through a very, very lengthy and I won't say contentious because they met with everyone, every abutter, every community member, every civic association, even outside. They are caught in that limbo, as former Councilor Ross had mentioned, and I think that moving forward it is vital that we honor some of those agreements that happened before, particularly as we have a situation now where a would-be competitor is looking at the same general vicinity because the first group that has gone through the process has agreed to be medicinal only has been caught in limbo. So I won't ask Councilor Ross to comment on this, but I think as we discuss conversations with the administration, as we begin our budget process, it is vital that we allocate resources for the Office of Emerging Industries and make sure that they have the support they need to move faster on many of these things. One person or two people cannot be in charge of this brand new industry. We need to make sure that the city is equipped to deal with that. So look forward to that in the weeks and months ahead.
Thank you, Councilor O'Malley. The Chair concurs. So thank you, Michael, for your time and attention and your talent and obviously helping us sort of focus on these critical areas. So I appreciate that.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Good to see you. If I may ask the administration panel to now come down. I know that John Barros, who's the Chief of Economic Development, is also joined by our Chief of Civic Engagement and Neighborhood Services. That's Jerome Smith. So welcome to both of you gentlemen. I understand that Alexis is sick, so her absence is excused, but we have two very capable administration officials in front of us, both the director, the chief, both two chiefs. How do you like that? We got two chiefs with us today. So you have the floor, Chief Barros, and it's good to see you. And that's also important to note for those. I know that we have several alum of BC High in here, so we had a big win the other night, 4 overtime victory at the Boston Garden for our BC High Eagles hockey team. So always good to see you, Chief.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Chairman Flaherty, Councilor Janey, and other members of the council. We appreciate the invitation to testify. Thank you, Councilor Janey, for your leadership on this ordinance on the issue of equity and inclusion in the cannabis industry here in the city of Boston. I am joined by Chief Smith, and the intro statement will be short so that we can get into the conversation because there's a lot to talk about. I want to say that Mayor Walsh and all of us in his administration share your strong desire to ensure that this new emerging industry be used as an economic development, wealth creation, good job securing tool to lift the people of Boston up. In particular, we want to create a regulatory system that promotes upward mobility in those areas and for those individuals who have been negatively impacted by past cannabis-related policies and laws. We are committed to working with the council and the public on how to best utilize our existing resources and potentially create new programs to support an inclusive and diverse cannabis industry in Boston. Today, we are simply here to continue our conversation, listen, and discuss how we together can create a thoughtful and impactful policy that achieves our mutual goal of ensuring that all Bostonians can benefit from the new economic opportunities being created. Thank you.
Thank you. That's good. So obviously welcome to both chiefs. Question, I guess, which sort of, I guess, emanated from colleagues in the first panel with respect to those that have gone through the initial process and got the letter of non-opposition from the council. I know that Chief Jerome Smith has been involved in that and played a critical role, obviously, on behalf of the administration, working with the district and at-large councilors here, as well as all the community groups. So my hope is that you're still involved in this process moving forward, sort of as the head of civic engagement. But I'm not sure what, if any, role had changed when the letter of non-opposition was sort of no longer the criteria, and then we set up sort of a new board and commission here in the city. But I would be insisting on behalf of the council that you stay sort of a big part of this whole debate and discussion, because you were there at the ground level working through all these issues. You know what these issues are, particularly through the Office of Neighborhood Services. So I hope that that's going to continue to be the case, that your involvement in this issue moving forward will be active and engaged, but also, I guess, with those 5 or 6 applicants that are kind of in limbo, that may have contracts and leases and investors all on the hook here, as a matter of basic fairness to those folks, so that they don't lose their life savings and/or their investors, and/or be held accountable for leases that they've signed or contracts that they've signed. Can we let them up for air, and can we bring some finality to them, and then move forward with, obviously, with the things that we're talking about today?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am still involved in the process. The Office of Neighborhood Services, I had originally had the liaisons hosting the meeting. I no longer have that. My director of policy and my chief of staff have broken up the meetings between the 2 of them, because we wanted to make sure the meetings are held and they're consistent the way that they're held. As far as the main process, knowing that this is an emergent industry, the mayor has taken that and put that in the Cabinet of Economic Development. So I'm kind of helping as far as the community process part of the economic development, but so that's been removed from my cabinet per se. I do remember, and I do appreciate sitting with you, and she just left, but Councilor Wu, when she was the president, but the medical process was different back then, and when we were all scrambling and trying to figure this out. And so what the decision was is that the mayor was not, we were not issuing letters of non-opposition themselves, and the way the law was written, it was either the chief executive or the legislative body of the city or town. So sitting with President Wu at the time, we made a decision that the council, the district councilors, would carry that lever, and that the letter of non-opposition would come from the council. It is our belief still currently that those individuals are cited. There is no reason at all for the administration or the city to ask for more process, to put them through another process, to do. They are done and solved. So I think that any sort of conversation about grandfathering, I think we would be supportive of that, because they went through the legal process at the time. What has happened subsequently is the law changed, and the state went from not really caring, I shouldn't say caring, not really focused on the community process to being like really detailed about what the community process is. So if you look at the medical marijuana law and the current cannabis law that we have, you will see that the medical marijuana had no real community process explicitly laid out. Whereas the new cannabis law says when the meeting is going to happen, how do you have to post in the newspaper. So there's all these very detailed criteria from the state about what we do, and we would never make a previous applicant that you guys had already voted and vetted on. I know both counselors, they had some interesting conversations with those processes, and I don't think the administration, as far as we're concerned, those things were passed with the previous law. They are legal. They are still going through. And any way that we can be helpful, if you guys identify any issues that we do have, we'd be happy to solve those problems.
Very good. And as much as I'm insisting as the chair that you stay actively involved, we want to make sure that members of the council, particularly my district colleagues,
absolutely
are involved. It seems like when the process of sort of that letter of non-opposition kind of had disappeared, sort of the, I guess, the engagement piece with the council. So I want to make sure that hopefully this ordinance, and we've had conversation with the lead author on that be included at some point. Those applicants have to sort of come back to the council, or at least be working with the district council, particularly if they're going to try to locate in a neighborhood.
So I think that in my conversations with the staff at the CCC, when they were thinking through their community process, they were also witnessing across the Commonwealth a number of cities and towns who were throwing up major roadblocks to take away the right for individuals to have access to cannabis. And so I think that what they did was is they took away that letter of non-opposition because they saw that as political bodies throwing up roadblocks. So instead, what the city has done is we've treated it as a citing of the ZBA. So it's just like going through a normal development process. But again, this is a new industry. We are trying things out. I think it's great that there's an ordinance actually before us to have a debate about how the process goes forward. I think I'm open to how we do these processes. I don't think I have the corner of the market on how this process is done. Mm-hmm. These meetings, a couple councilors have been at these meetings, can be rough. They are long. It kind of makes you feel as though be surprised that this thing passed in the city of Boston. When you go to these meetings, the people that show up, You tell them, wait, 70% of your neighborhood voted for this, and everybody in the room is in opposition. So, as we go through this, I would love the support, and if there's something that you think that one of my staff have not done well or we should work on, I'd love that feedback, because right now it's just two of my staff who are covering the whole city, trying to do their best to push this issue forward. But again, feedback is always helpful.
And thank you, Chief. Your work has been invaluable on this, and we appreciate that. Chief Barros, what are the pros and cons about doing sort of a 2-to-1 ratio, and could there be some unintended consequences in that? And when we're starting at the ground level, brand new industry.
So that was his idea,
Yeah,
just so you know where I got it from. Let's be very clear. At the December 4th hearing, you said 2-to-1.
Right.
So go
So
ahead.
brand new industry, sort of 1-to-1 is sort of is an equitable formula, but sort of as Councilor Janey had referenced, maybe you.
As Councilor Janey
what are the pros and cons?
I want to give you all the credit.
I will absolutely take credit for wanting to make sure that there is in fact inclusion and diversity within the industry. I do believe that looking at the licenses and understanding the distribution of licenses is the way to go. I think we need to balance the growth of the industry with the licenses, and so this is something that I've said to Councilor Janey. I know there were pressures for us to not be in the way of economic development, and I think that that's right. But I think we also have to balance that with making sure people can participate. And so I think that's the balance we've got to find. And the more we've learned about how hard it is, and I know you guys are going to hear from other people later, and what the barriers are, we need to talk about how to remove those barriers so people can participate. So I continue to be in favor of having some deliberate and intentional approach to distribution of the licenses.
Very good, thank you. Councilor Janey, any questions at this time?
Yes, so I wanted to come back to the applicants that are kind of applied way back when, that Councilor Ross mentioned, that are kind of just stuck in limbo. How many are we talking about?
I do not know. I think his number about 5 is probably about right. It wasn't, a lot of individuals didn't come forward for medical at the time, so it was like Patriot Care. There's one in Brighton that's looking to switch over. I think there's one on Newberry Street. It's a very small handful. We can get you that number.
One in Dorchester.
We now have,
I think 5 or 6, right?
We now have completed 11 community host agreements. Of the 11, 4 completed community host agreements around medical are cited, completed, ZBA approved. I believe 2 of them are open for business, and the others are gearing up for opening for business, but they have completed our process. We also have 6 completed host agreements. Of the completed host agreements, 4 have gone through the ZBA process, 2 have been scheduled, and so we continue to move in that direction. Of the 11 different host agreements, they are spread out throughout the city in 9 different neighborhoods, and we have a good representation in terms of diversity. So when you start to look at participation, we're pretty proud of the diverse applicants, both in terms of gender and race, impacted communities that are participating in the 11, particularly the 6 regional recreational retail agreements that we've signed.
So clarifying question, I'm not sure if I misheard you. Did you say 11 host community agreements or 6?
11 host community agreements. I just wanted to break down the kinds of host agreements that we have.
So out of the 11,
out of the 11, 6 are retail.
6 are retail.
6 retail, and once again,
And the other 5 are medical.
the other 4 are medical, 1 manufacturing. And if you remember the Roxbury site, 100 Hamden Street, is the one manufacturing business that has been cited, gone through the community process, completed its host agreement, and also obviously went through the ZBA.
Which 2 are open?
The 2 medical sites that are open are one located in Alston on Harvard Ave. The other is on Milk Street in downtown. Patriot Care.
Yep. And you said, how many are, you said diverse applicants? How many?
I believe 4 of the 6 licenses, 4 of the 6 completed host community agreements have diverse applicants, both gender and race.
4 out of the 6.
4 out of the 6.
Retail.
Retail, that's correct.
And how are you determining that the ownership of the company is diverse? So are you saying the ownership or the person before you who has applied? Like what, how are you measuring?
So
diversity?
we are looking at it both in terms of CEO, so leadership of the business. We're looking at it in terms of ownership. And in ownership, we have a wide distribution among the 4 of ownership of Latino, African American, women, local owned, veteran owned. We've tracked for all of those. And when it comes to the 4 that I've talked to, all of which have racial diversity, I don't have the breakdown in terms of women percentages on the 4, but we've got a really diverse group of people who have come up and that we've moved through the process.
Yep. And so again, are you looking at the ownership of the company? Like, are you looking at who owns what percentage of the company? How are you determining? Because my understanding from the December hearing
meeting
that the question wasn't even being asked, whether or not
was not being asked.
That whether or not an applicant qualified as a social equity applicant from the state or an economic empowerment applicant.
No,
so we weren't, but I think you've corrected that now.
Right. So we have asked about social equity and empowerment. We were not asking in the application, but since that conversation, we did go in and find out who was who. I don't have that breakdown for you today, but I will get you that breakdown.
That would be great.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. And so how are you prioritizing equity in the application process?
So equity, so we've been very clear as administration, we've been public, and in dialogue with everyone, we've said that equity is really important. We have allowed some of the people who are working for their own business to talk to others who are working to start up their businesses in hopes of creating relationships. We've allowed them to contact each other or have encouraged it, and some of the relationships have come that way. Other relationships have come because people have relationships and they've talked to people and brought them in. But almost anyone, and I want to say everyone who has come before us who has a recreational retail host agreement today has some level of participation. I've got to get you those percentages, but 4 we're going to represent today to you as being diverse applicants that we can put in front of you, I think, meeting general understanding of either empowerment and or equity license holders.
How much revenue, and I don't know if you'll have the answer to this, do you anticipate that we'll be able to generate through this industry in terms of tax, the 3% tax? Do you have an estimate? We
do not have estimates at this point. As you know, this is a fast-growing industry, but we do not have revenue. Now, some of the challenge is, in fact, that most of the revenue will be generated through sales tax. And as you know, Boston does not collect sales tax, and so we want to put that into the context of talking about tax generation for the city. We do capture a 3% on this, but the overwhelming percentage of revenue that is going to be captured by government will go to the state.
No, I know, but the revenue that we do capture, I think it's important to anticipate what we hope to bring in and then how we'll use that. My ordinance calls for reinvesting that into communities that have been disproportionately impacted to support small business development. There's a lot of support and help that many folks need to really make sure we have an inclusive economy. I'd like to switch to the community side. I've been to a community meeting that I felt so as people have already mentioned, you mentioned that the meetings can go long, that people tend to be frustrated and angry. And I think at a number of things. One, I think some folks want to turn back the clock and don't want to see this move forward in their community. I think the other thing, though, is really the lack of information and understanding, not just about the industry and the opportunity here, but that it is in fact here, whether, and I believe the number from December was 51 businesses that will open.
Floor.
And
So,
a floor.
By state law, it's 20% of the total number
Right.
of retail
And I believe that
locations.
number was 51
I
when we
believe
do
it might be 52. Yeah.
52, 51, that there is going to be 50, over 50 minimum. So I don't think people know and understand that. I think it would be helpful to do some framing. I know you've said important that people understand how that particular census tract voted in that community, that people understand it's going to be 51, 52 minimum, not the max, but the minimum. And I think then the question for residents who have questions or concerns is really who then do we want to partner with? Who will work with us around a good community benefits package? Who can we support in terms of, you know, the local kid who grew up in this community? And the meeting that I attended did not do that framing. It was just kind of, here's who I am from ONS, and here are the people who want to, you know, bring in a cannabis business to your community. And so I think it just got off to a bad start. So I think there's more that we can do in terms of educating people about, you know, the need to create an inclusive economy, the fact that it is here, whether we're talking about legal cannabis or illegal cannabis, and the more that legal stores are prohibited from opening, the more that the illegal market will continue to thrive. And so to the extent that people are really concerned about children getting access to marijuana, important to make sure that there are stores, legal stores available who will have the safeguards in place and the security in place to ensure that it won't get into the hands of children. But in a legal market, anything can happen. Somebody can lace your drugs with something, you know, your the cannabis with some sort of drug on top of it, which can be deadly, very dangerous, or it can get into the hands of children. And I don't think any of us want to see that. So any suggestions moving forward about how we can improve the process in terms of the community, I think would be helpful. And I think the need for more education around what the city is doing, more just understanding about this industry and the opportunities that are available. Any thoughts?
We have had conversations internally within my department about having more conversations with residents separate of applicants. I do not believe that it's fair for an applicant who is just trying to start a business to have to move the mentality of an entire community in a 2-hour period. I believe that as a city, we should be providing opportunities for residents to come to forums, open houses, and have discussions. We did it in Dorchester. We've done it in, nope, we did it in Dorchester. And we had the CCC come out and talk with residents. Residents had the opportunity to ask what type of questions should we be asking of applicants. It gets into your point about safety, you know, how does the product move in and out of your business, all these things. And so it was an interesting experience that we actually had the CCC and the city there, and the residents were able to say, what should I be asking, right? Because residents are already comfortable of talking about, if you're a restaurant, what are your hours of operation? Where's your exhaust fence going? So they in the mindset, they are clearly know what questions to ask. I think that what happens now in these community meetings is there is a group of individuals, not all, but a group of individuals who come in who, like you said, want to fight the law and think that we need to turn back the clock. And I think that when that group kind of goes off, that person in the room who actually wants to have the more thoughtful process questions gets kind of shouted down. And so I think that we have to do a better job of explaining to residents what it is that they should get from this applicant. What are your security? What are your hours of operation? Who are you employing? What are your delivery schedules? Where are you dropping off your deliveries? Are these out front, or is there a place? So there are just natural things that residents are used to asking for other businesses that they haven't applied to this business yet. And I think having more of those conversations would be great. I'd be happy to partner with any of the counselors, district counselors, at-large counselors, if you guys want to do forums on these types of conversations. You guys have networks, we have networks, and I think between our networks we could drive a lot of residents to these open houses to have these conversations. And I think that the more that we get people comfortable with the idea that this is a legal business in the city, I think you'll see the temperature kind of lower in some of these community meetings.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm interested in your thoughts around exempting equity businesses from the buffer zones as they currently exist, either or both of you.
Yeah, I think that is something we want to discuss. Yeah.
That's something I'll challenge you guys on, just because I think the buffer has led to sort of the diversification as
Which is
Chief Jerome,
Yeah, it's
Jerome Smith of the first round of applicants. It's fairly spread out across the city, so sort of no one neighborhood is kind of that feeding frenzy ground. If you will.
I think it's something we want to discuss, Councilor, but I don't think it's something that we're saying today is automatic.
Right, but I think we need
there's
to.
got to be a thoughtful.
Yeah, so if the threshold, to Councilor Janey's initial question was, it's 20% of the, for those at home, it's 20% of the liquor stores, correct? Because you had mentioned retail.
Retail alcohol stores.
This does not apply to any of the new licenses that we're talking about potentially creating in the city. But so that's a threshold of around 51, 52-ish, right?
Yep.
I say we have to get to that point first, and then if we want to discuss talking about where, if the buffer zone is being, I guess, an impediment, if you will, to the industry and or particularly to equity applicants, then I think that's when we sort of maybe start to think about where can we, but if we come right out of the gate before we hit the threshold of 51 and start to trample all over the buffer zone, I'm going to fight the new administration tooth and nail on that. There was reasoning behind it. It was thoughtful. This body supported it overwhelmingly. The administration supported it. The BRA supported it. The zoning commission supported it, and the zoning board of appeals supported it. And if we just, because we have a new emergency industry, we have a new person up there, they have to be aware of it. I think we might have two competing now that are within 107 feet of each other. That got deferred about a week or two ago for that specific reason. So I think we need to meet the threshold first, and then if we need to do that. But I don't think we come out and trample on it right now.
I think it's important that we meet the threshold if equity is center to all of that we're doing, number one. Number two, Councilor Ross offered very thoughtful testimony that we look at Cambridge, which does exempt the equity applicants. And so my question is rooted in his recommendation. And so what I'm hearing from you is we need to discuss that more.
I think the public just witnessed the debate that just occurred regarding the buffer zone,
absolutely.
and I think that
and
it's
I think
a
we'll
conversation
hear from
that we have to have.
testimony today, as we heard back in January at the working session, as well as the December hearing, that equity applicants, at least, are finding it very difficult with the buffer zones because these larger companies are coming in, and then voila, there's a buffer zone, and they're getting locked out. So I've got examples of people who live in my district that has happened to. I'm interested in your thoughts on buffer zones as it relates to cultivation. Should there be the same kind of buffer zone for a cultivator?
So to the buffer zones, we also have to acknowledge that the buffer zones were created by the residents in the city of Boston. It was the buffer zone was created because Patriot Care was being cited, and a group of residents that live in the towers over towards the theater district had come to us and said, if we are going to do this, we do not want 15 in downtown Crossing. The council was appreciative of that testimony, and then that's where we came up with the buffer zone. And so any change to the buffer zone is going to have a public conversation, because there are some residents who believe that it is a protection for them, and we're going to have to work through that. At the same time, a buffer zone can